Hello, thanks for tuning in. Today in our sermon, we look at the story of the prophet Elijah and the widow. This is a story from long, long ago, before the Israelites went into exile, between the time of King Solomon and the exile. And in this story, we see the prophet in his early days, and we see that he is in a position of need. And he goes, and God leads him to a widow from another country, and he experiences hospitality. And it's hospitality from somebody that really doesn't have a lot to give. So we contemplate that in our sermon today, considering what it's like to be neighborly, to show hospitality, or even just to bless others when we ourselves feel like we don't have very much to give. So I hope you enjoy that message and can maybe take something to apply to your life today. As a reminder, you are welcome to join us in person. We meet at Science Ridge Church on Science Ridge Road in Sterling at 10 a.m. on Sundays. And you can find more information about our church, and you can see past sermons. You can find a study guide with questions related to this sermon at our website, scienceridgechurch.org. So with that introduction out of the way, here's our sermon today. This week we're continuing to think about what it means to be neighborly, going all the way back to that teaching of loving our neighbors and being neighborly, showing hospitality, blessing others. And sometimes being neighborly or showing hospitality is hard. It takes time. It might involve the risk of rejection, or we might feel like we don't have anything that is worthwhile to offer. And often we might be worried about someone's perceived expectations when really, our neighbor maybe just would appreciate us thinking of them or just the offer of help. And yet we still sometimes feel inadequate. An example, on my bike trip a number of years ago, there was one place we stayed at where the guy just felt so bad he didn't have any beds for us to sleep in. We were sleeping on his couches, and we were just thankful that we were sleeping in a house and not in a tent. So he felt inadequate, felt like he didn't have anything worthwhile to offer, but for us it was a great blessing. Last spring, I took down a tree at my house that was starting the roots were heaving up part of my driveway, and on very rudely short notice, I asked a neighbor if he wanted some wood in exchange for helping me cut up the tree. And he just jumped right over, brought his chainsaw, and in a couple of days we got the tree all cleaned up. But I felt bad that I wasn't being mindful of his schedule. I didn't check anything in advance, and I almost didn't ask him for the help because I was worried about burdening him with that job. But he just jumped right in and he helped me cut it up. So there are times in our lives where we might feel like we don't have the resources or we don't have the planning or whatever it might be to offer hospitality or to do something kind for somebody else, to bless somebody, because for whatever reason we feel inadequate or we don't feel like we are enough. We might be feeling short on resources or on time, whatever it might be. Now, today's scripture considers a situation fairly similar to this. We have a woman who has almost nothing to give, but she decides to offer the little bit that she does have. There's a man that is hungry and in need, and he approaches someone looking for help. So let's look here at 1 Kings chapter 17, and we'll see what we can learn today about being neighborly when we feel like we might not have much to give. So I'm in 1 Kings chapter 17, and I'm starting a little bit before our actual story, just to give us some context here. So 1 Kings chapter 17, starting in verse 1, going through verse 16. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Gilead said to Ahab, King Ahab, "As the Lord the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word." Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, "Leave here, turn eastward and hide in the ravine of Kerith, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have ordered the ravens to feed you there." So Elijah did what the Lord had told him. He went to the ravine of Kerith, east of the Jordan, and stayed there. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the mornings, and bread and meat in the evenings, and he drank from the brook. Sometime later, the brook dried up, because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah and said, "Go at once to Zarephath of Sidon and stay there. I have commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food." So he went to Zarephath, and when he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so that I may drink?" As she was going to get it, he called, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first make a small cake of bread for me from what you have, and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry, until the day the Lord gives rain on the land." So she went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. So let's start by filling in some of the context of this story, because it takes place a long time ago. This is the first time that Elijah shows up in Scripture. The first time he is mentioned is here, starting in verse 17. He just arrives on the scene. And to kind of give broader context to this, so the land of Israel was ruled by David, blanket on names here, Saul, David, and then Solomon. And then after Solomon, the land was split into two. And so we had the northern kingdom, which was called Israel. The capital was in Samaria. That's where the Samaritans come from. And then the southern kingdom was Judah. So Ahab becomes the king of Israel. He's about the fifth or sixth king since the split. And Ahab marries Jezebel. Okay, that name might be familiar. Ahab marries Jezebel. Jezebel is the daughter of the king of Sidon. The daughter of the king of Sidon. And Ahab begins worshiping Baal and Asherah. If you go and read at the very end of chapter 16, it talks about how Ahab did more to provoke God than any other king before him. So this is the context. Ahab is a pretty evil king, and he's doing all these bad things. And so Elijah shows up on the scene, and it says, "There will be no more rain." And this is in reference to Deuteronomy chapter 11, actually. Elijah is bringing forth this almost this prophecy or this promise from God from Deuteronomy that says, "Take care lest you be enticed to turn away and worship other gods and bow down before them. Then the Lord's anger will burn against you, and he will shut up the heavens so that no rain will fall on the ground and yield no produce, and then you will perish from the land the God has given you." So Elijah, in keeping with the promise from Deuteronomy, shuts up the skies so there will be no more rain. And this starts the rivalry between Elijah and Ahab. And then we have Jezebel. We have eventually the calling down of the fire to the offering, and on. You can read the story about Elijah. But after here, we're not getting that far into it, but Elijah closes the skies, and then Elijah goes into hiding. And he lives by this brook, and these ravens bring him food. There is a Jewish collection of teachings called the Midrash. And in there, that Jewish teaching, it's got a bunch of stuff that it's kind of fun, but I'm not going to bring it into the sermon this morning because it'll get us sidetracked. But an interesting thing here is that Jewish teaching is kind of like the oral, they take it more seriously than mythology, but the oral tradition that was passed down is that these ravens were actually stealing food from King Ahab's storehouse and bringing it to Elijah. That's what the Jewish Midrash suggests might have happened. So that's maybe, you can think about that in your mind. The evil king is getting what he's doing. The ravens from God are taking his food and giving it to Elijah. You can just that's extra biblical storytelling. But the point here is that God is providing for Elijah's need, and then the brook dries up, and God sends Elijah to Sidon, to Jezebel's homeland, to this widow. Now let's put ourselves in the context, or put ourselves in the shoes, I should say, of the widow for just a moment. Okay, so she is a widow. She has lost her husband one way or the other. And as a widow, she is a person that is already dependent on others. Back in those days, a widow couldn't just go and get a job any old place, like maybe today they could. But she is a person that is already dependent on the hospitality, on the generosity of others for her survival. And she has a son, but the story suggests that son is perhaps too young to care for them both. Otherwise, he would be getting a job and he could care for them. But this is perhaps a younger son. And there has been a drought. The crops have failed, food is scarce, and she has run out of food. There's only a little bit left and now there is hardly anything for herself, let alone to give to others. So if we put ourselves in the shoes of that widow, I wonder if any of us could relate to ever feeling like that. Feeling like we are helpless, we're just dependent on others to get us through the day, we're maybe running on empty. Maybe it's been a while since we've been grocery shopping and we're down to our last slice of bread. Maybe we're on our last straw. Maybe we've got our last little few moments that we have to ourselves. We're just running on empty and barely having enough for ourselves. And then, for this widow, a strange guy walks up and asks for the last thing that she has. Now, maybe for us it's not a strange guy. Maybe for us we're just on our last wit's end and our spouse walks up and wants the last little bit that we have. Whatever it might be, you maybe perhaps have felt at the end of your rope. And we know that God said to Elijah that he was commanding the widow to feed him, but we wonder if the widow knew that God had chosen her, or did he just go and show up and she wasn't in on the plan? We don't know, but we do know that God was about to work in both of their lives. And this is perhaps the first application point we could take away from this, is that sometimes our hospitality or our neighborly actions might be God's way of working in someone else's life. That our hospitality, our blessing of others, might be God doing something greater in someone else's life. So this week on the radio, I heard a story about a man who was going through a really rough patch in life. And he didn't go into all the details, but it was a rough patch. And he was in the city walking or standing near the sidewalk, and he felt the breeze of a bus go by him. And in that moment, he thought, maybe if the next bus comes by, I'll just step out into it and just end it all. That was the mindset that he was in. And as he's kind of waiting there, kind of keeping an eye out for another bus, he looks up, and there is a woman standing there who looks him directly in the eyes and gives him a bright, big, beaming smile. One of those smiles and the eye contact that just reached into his soul and completely changed his attitude and outlook on life. And now he said he's a minister. God was working in his life through the kindness of another person. Now, whether we offer somebody a smile or we offer them a ride, a card in the mail, a compliment, invite them over for supper, we pay for somebody behind us in line, whatever it might be, whether it's persistently or consistently praying for somebody, our actions might be God using us without us even knowing it. That little act of blessing in somebody's life might have a bigger, more profound effect than we might be aware. In this story, both Elijah and the widow have needs. Elijah needed food, a place to stay, and the woman needed security. Not only food, but the assurance that there would be food tomorrow, enough for her and her family. And God brought them together, the woman with her generosity and Elijah with his gift of miracles. They each had their needs provided for. They were each a part of God's plan for each other's life. Another story that came to mind as I was thinking about this is the story of Ananias helping Paul, or Saul, in that time. Saul was out there persecuting Christians, and he encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus and was struck blind, and he was terrorizing them. And God said to Saul, or who would become Paul, "Go into the city, and you will be told what to do." That's the only direction that God gave him. And so Saul was waiting there in Damascus, and Ananias, who knew that Saul had been terrorizing the Jesus followers, he desired safety and security. God called on him and led them together, and they both had their needs met. Ananias had his need and desire for security met, and Paul or Saul had his need and desire for sight returned to him. Sometimes our actions of blessing others can be part of God's larger actions in their life. So the next thing that we see is that sometimes when we are led into different situations, it might be that we feel like we have little to offer. So the first point was that sometimes our actions are God working without us knowing it in the moment. The next thing is that sometimes God leads us into these situations when we have little to offer. The widow, whether God had given her this warning that there was going to be a visitor coming or not, this widow didn't really have much to start with. We're kind of spoiled today. If we have a guest that is coming, we can make a quick trip to the store to stock up, or worst case scenario, we all go out to eat together when they get here. But back for this widow, This drought meant that there was no food. The shelves were bare, the restaurants were closed, and this widow only had enough supplies for one final meal. And not even a fancy meal at that, just a little bit of flour and oil. And now there is this guest that's looking for, almost demanding hospitality from her. Now today, we don't necessarily feel that level of need. Instead, we might want to make a good impression to our guests, but at the same time, even though we have so much, we often want to hoard our resources. We might feel like we have limited time. We might feel like we have limited food or limited bandwidth to give out to others. And the thought of blessing others with the little that we have sounds almost overwhelming to us sometimes. We might feel like we have so little to give. Mix that feeling with the desire that we want to look like we have abundance, look like we have a lot to give. And so we get this result that sometimes we just don't initiate. We don't offer blessings to our neighbors. We don't offer hospitality generously. We save it just for special occasions or special events. But if we are open to God's work in our lives, sometimes God will intentionally stretch us to offer someone a blessing when we feel like we don't have much to give. Henry Nouwen says that poverty makes a good host. He says, those that have little materially have nothing to lose. You know, this widow, she hardly had anything left. There's nothing to lose. I'll give the rest away. Henry Nouwen says, their own life situation has freed them from the illusion that everything is under their control. Their only hope is that God will provide, and if that is true, why not share? If our only hope is that God will provide for us in those moments, when we feel like we have nothing, when we are emptied out, if we are relying on God to provide, then why not share that generosity with others? Now, Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He says, God says, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made complete or perfect or fulfilled in your weakness. You know, sometimes God wants us to be reminded that we are not all-powerful, that we are not completely capable of doing it on our own, that we need Jesus to be complete. I can tell you that there are many preachers that feel like when they give a poor sermon, and I've had these, you feel like you give a poor sermon, and then afterwards somebody comes up to you and says, that was just what I needed. Thank you so much. At the same time, I know many pastors that say, I felt like I gave the best sermon, everything was on point, and nobody said anything to me. God is made perfect in our weaknesses, and sometimes what we think of as weakness, sometimes what we think of as being inadequate is actually just what a person needs. Leah and I have had people stay at our house, and we're chatting, and soon the evening disappears, and we haven't had supper, and suddenly, oh no, it's late, we're tired, and we're getting ready to make supper when the guest says, you know, I am just really craving some cereal for a bedtime snack. That's all I want. You know, we feel inadequate, feel like we don't have everything together, and then it turns out that, you know, we have cereal, we have milk, and that is just what they are wanting. This widow had barely anything to offer. The temptation that she might have felt would have been to save what little she had, to hoard her resources, spend these last days with just her son before hunger took them both. But God led this hungry man into her life, and out of her actions of hospitality, God took care of her needs as well. So far, we've talked about how both the widow and Elijah were answering each other's needs that they had. We talked about how God sometimes leads us into these opportunities to provide hospitality or blessing when we feel like we don't have anything to give. The last thing that we can take away from this story is that often the guest brings a gift. Often the guest brings a gift. As we give, we often receive. And I'm not necessarily talking about, you know, when you go to visit somebody, it's responsible, or it's often we think we need to bring a hostess gift. You go to visit somebody and you bring something. But sometimes it's more than that. This woman here decides that she will make a little bit of bread. She gives in, I'm going to provide hospitality to this man. She makes a little bit of bread, and she gives the first bit to this strange foreign man. And then she notices there's still a little bit of flour left, so she makes another little bit of bread for herself. You know, there's still a little bit of flour left. I'll make some for my son. Still a little bit of flour and oil left for the next meal. Isn't that interesting? And on it goes. This stranger brought a gift with him. He brought a miracle from God to keep them alive through the famine. The gift that the guest brings isn't always this apparent or radical. A guest might bring stories from their travels. They might bring a connection to new places. Maybe your guest lives just down the road, and the gift that they bring is just an evening of conversation and games or connecting. There are many ways that our lives can be enriched when we bless the people we encounter in life. I think of Jesus feeding the 5,000. Jesus hosted this large gathering of people. And there was one guest that brought forward a gift to share, a little bit of fish and some loaves. And Jesus used this gift and again blessed it and blessed the crowd with it. And then this circle of giving and blessing and receiving and giving again continued. Now, I do need to say that sometimes the gift that a guest brings is not always a pleasant gift. Michelle Hirschberger tells a story about a stranger that came into a Miami Church of the Brethren congregation one morning. And this stranger did not bring a very pleasant gift. He ended up killing the preacher and stabbed the preacher's 24-year-old daughter. It was not a very good gift at all. And as time went on, the police found the man that did this and arrested him. But the church decided they were going to keep their doors open to that neighborhood. And Suzanne, the daughter who was stabbed, and the church got together and they worked to write letters to the judge and to the different officials because this man was going to be sentenced to death. He was up for the death penalty in the trials. And as a Church of the Brethren congregation, they believe that that's not something that Jesus taught. And so they wrote letters and worked for over 10 years through 3 different trials, and many times they testifying in court themselves about that day. And after their work, the killer was sentenced to 3 life sentences instead of the death penalty. And at that final hearing, Suzanne, who was the daughter that was stabbed, addressed the court, and her father was the one that was killed. Suzanne addressed the court with tears in her eyes, thanked the jury for giving this man an opportunity at life. Suzanne's heart and her conviction that the church's, Suzanne's heart and conviction and the church's heart and conviction was that all life had value. And that conviction touched countless people's lives. It challenged others to think about what justice means. It challenged people to think about if retribution could really bring peace. Challenged people to think about what is forgiveness and what does a possibility of a transformed life look like? What does it mean to be obedient to the teaching that anyone can find hope and deliverance in Jesus if given enough time? It challenged people to think about what it means to love our enemies as God commanded us. Now, this particular gift that this stranger brought was not a gift that God would have wanted. God did not desire that for the church. But in the brokenness of our humanity, God worked to take that bad gift, that awful, evil gift, and turn it around to provide hope and healing for those that were attacked, and a greater teaching and a perspective to the greater world. Now, chances are the guest that you might have is probably not going to try to kill you. I really hope if you have a guest at your house, they're not going to try to kill you. Hopefully they will bless you and give you gratitude and joy as you offer hospitality. But the point I want to make is that the gift that the guest brings won't always be apparent. They might not come with flowers or a side dish for the meal, and they might not multiply your food for you, and perhaps they might not fill your house with laughter. There might be awkward silences depending on the guest that you have. Your good works might go unnoticed, whatever that might be. But you might leave after that encounter. You might leave noticing that the world is a little bit different. You might have a different perspective, seeing the world through somebody else's eyes. Maybe you won't take yourself so seriously when you're blessing somebody else or offering hospitality. Maybe you'll lose a little bit of the fear that you have about engaging with others. Maybe even after an act of blessing, you won't feel such a burden the next time an opportunity comes up. There are many small ways that a guest can bring some sort of a gift to the host. Now, as we contemplate the story of Elijah and the widow, we are reminded that God is at work in everyone's life in different ways. And perhaps our act of kindness for a neighbor or an act of kindness for a stranger might be part of an answered prayer or part of God working in their life. Even something as simple as giving a big smile to someone who's having a hard day can be God working in their life. We're also reminded that we can offer blessings to others, even when we feel like we have nothing to give. Everything we have is ultimately a gift from God. And as we pass on God's gifts to help others, they can be used by God, perhaps even multiplied in some way. And in the end, they will have perhaps a larger effect than we might anticipate. And as we give to others, as we bless others in our lives, as we host people, we can often receive gifts in return. Not always what we might expect, not necessarily always present in that moment, but we always receive something back from others when we give. The widow gave limited food and received unlimited food. Elijah gave a miracle. He didn't give America. He gave a miracle. A miracle. Sorry, got sidetracked there. Elijah gave a miracle and received a home to stay in. Suzanne gave up her hate and desire for revenge and received peace and healing at a level that could really only come from God. And ultimately, we see in this story a God who desires to be our host. A God who desires to be our host. We are invited to receive good gifts from God. Ultimately, good gifts that God offers us in Jesus. We come to Jesus with nothing to give. We are like the widow. We are on our last bit of food that we've been trying to survive with. And that last little bit of food can't help us much longer. We need the goodness of God in our lives. We can't buy God's gifts with acts or with service. We need to give up the last bit of ourselves to Jesus, and in return, we will be blessed with an abundant life. As the guest, we bring ourselves, we bring our lives, our gratitude, and our praise back to God. And that's all Jesus wants from us. He just wants us. He wants all of us. The widow was ultimately, when she was deciding to give up this bread, she was giving up her opportunity at life. And in return, Elijah rewarded her with an unending supply of food. May we all come to God like the widow, with nothing but ourselves to offer. May we reach out to others and offer them blessing, even when we feel like there is so little that we can give. And in the process, may we experience God's abundance, God's healing, God's peace and joy in our lives. There we go. That's our sermon. We are invited to show hospitality to others, and even when we feel like we have little to give, God often provides for our needs, sometimes even through the guests themselves. This is your challenge for this week. Go and show blessing to somebody. Go and extend hospitality. Be a good neighbor, whether that's just a smile, saying some consistent prayers for somebody that's in need, writing a card, holding the door open. There's many ways that you can be a positive person in somebody's life, and you never know what difference it might make. May you go forth and be a blessing this week.